Welcome to Imbokodo Women's Roundtable. My name is Yoli Sanjamela. We're joined by 5 formidable women. We'll be discussing LGBTQI and youth issues. Let me introduce you to them. Yaya Mavundla is a transgender, an award-winning transgender activist. Jade Madingwane, right next to her, works for the Forum for the Empowerment of Women, advocates for women's rights, Black lesbians in particular. Sihle Gilichana is also an activist, social justice activist, and was the first openly queer person to enter for the Miss SA pageant. Gina Lee Ellis is currently studying at Wits University. She's doing her postgraduate in international studies at Wits University. She also champions issues of women, queer people, and people of color. Zuleika Patel is an anti-racism and social activist. She's an author and international speaker. Well, let's get right to it to get to know the ladies more before we get into the meat of the issues. Yeah. First, if we were to start with you, you basically did not identify with the sex that was assigned to you at birth. What does that mean? How did you go about in your quest to change that? And when did you discover?
Very interesting question. I get to be asked that question a lot, probably every day. But I think it was in 2013 when I met, when I lived with Professor Cezanne Lemholi, who is both friend and I work with them, where I actually then discovered that they're actually trans people, because I used to think I was gay, for a lack of education, of course. But I think what's helped me was to say, I don't want to live my life based on what the book says. I needed to create my own experiences to say, this is how, as a trans person, I feel, and this is how I want to live. And that has really, really helped me to not to be like, to say different, but to be myself, to live the way I want to, not to put myself under the pressure to say, oh my gosh, now I need to take hormones, now I need to do this, now I need to go for surgery. When I want to do it, I'll do it, So I think that has really, really helped me to say, I'm not going to live my life based on what the book says, how trans people should be.
Yeah. Jade, if we were to just know you a bit before we get into the discussion, you're not only working for the Forum for the Empowerment of Women, you also work in the criminal justice system monitoring hate crimes. Tell us more about what you do and yourself.
Okay, so part of the work that I do at Forum for the Empowerment of Women is monitor hate crimes cases, right? And monitoring hate crime cases looks like supporting the victims and the victims of the families in opening the cases, in court support as well, because hate crimes cases in South Africa, they're on the rise each year. 2021 and 2022, every single month there was a hate crime case, that we needed to monitor, and particularly Black lesbian women from townships, And it's so difficult because there are no funds available for this kind of work, We have to kind of get the funding through maybe our main funding to make sure that we support the families, we support the victims of the families, and we make sure that the cases actually go to trial. And when these cases go to trial, because the hate crime bill is not in effect as yet, we need to kind of sensitize either the victims to say that whether the person has passed on or not, that this was a hate crime and not just a gender-based violence kind of case. Because in court, this is what they say. It's a gender-based violence, but it's not gender-based violence. We are being erased as queer people in South Africa each and every year, And so the hate crimes bill will help in making sure that when perpetrators are sentenced, they get a very harsh sentence. So
we'll explore those issues a bit further, but let's get to know Sihle Gcilitshana, who is a social justice activist. And as I mentioned before, the first openly queer person to enter for the Miss SA pageant. What was that experience like? And tell us just slightly more about yourself.
Okay, so by day I actually work at the Civic Tech Innovation Network that's based at the Wits School of Governance, and the simplest way to explain what we do is we work with people that use tech for good. So any kind of digital or technological basis that affects change but also really changes the way that people live on a day-to-day basis is what I do. And when I'm not wearing that hat, I think of myself as a social justice activist, because there are so many things that we need to be fighting for. Me as Sihle can't do that, and so it's usually easier when your activist work is also aligned to you and your identities and your values. And I think participating in the Miss South Africa pageant was one of the ways in which I enacted that, right? Not in any million years had I imagined that I would be the first there. I've said this openly, that I do think that there could have been other queer people in the spaces, but because of the stigmas that are held around being different, about identifying, and the questions like Yaya has mentioned that come up with you kind of openly sharing your orientation and your identity, then exposes you. So it was quite a shock for myself to be there. I think it was an interesting time because the management of the pageant was in transition, and so you could start seeing people that look like me. I in no way think of myself as a model, or would have even seen people that looked like me at the time. So I had dreadlocks, and perhaps the only reference we had for women that had participated in the pageant was Zizo Beda, who had dreadlocks when she won Miss Teen. But to be a rural-born, queer, black woman who was on that really was more about who saw themselves reflected in me. It was a big moment, not just for myself, but I also think that for South African queers, because one of the things I stressed was also that don't see me here and assume that the experience of all queers is judged by this one person. You were mentioning, Jade, that particularly in townships and rural areas, there is visceral violence and hate crimes being perpetrated against queer people. And that's one of the things that when you have a platform, you have to raise, unfortunately, is that I'm here, I'm safe, but what about everyone else that isn't, that is being judged, that is being tormented? And when there are no people that look like you in your immediate society, you tend to feel a little bit lost. You tend to feel like you must normalize yourself into what socialization has taught us to be. And so it was the biggest expression of being yourself. When I stood there, I was just like, as scary as it might be, as many people could be watching, all you were here is to speak about yourself and really advocate for your community, because we need that visibility every single day. And that's what we hope, I assume, with this roundtable, with all of us being here, is that one new person gets to find out that there's more to life than what we have been taught and what we're aware of.
Well, you can imagine how much more we're going to chat about when we get into the meat of matters. I've just asked her to introduce herself, and she gave us a mouthful. Gina Lee Ellis, you say you're advocating for women, queer folk, people of color, and you're saying they must take up spaces in civil society. What does that mean, while you tell us a bit about yourself?
I think oftentimes civil society is being created to be perpetuated by white, cis, heterosexual men. Mm-hmm. And these men have loud and powerful voices. And the space that civil society has continued to echo privileges these voices over women, over queer people, over people of color, especially since these spaces oftentimes come across as aggressive. This is the complete opposite. We're having a lovely conversation, a roundtable discussion, but these spaces usually come off aggressive, sexist, misogynistic, and very racist and exceptionally classist. The language used in these spaces are very inaccessible to poor people who don't have the same level of academia that other people may have. And I also think that I've worked a lot with children in my short life, and I think that really making language accessible, ideas accessible, and educating children informally is how we actually create the change that we want to see. So it really starts with the youth for me.
And Zuleika Patel, my last guest on my left. Zuleika, you were only 13 when you and other pupils were literally shoved into the spotlight, so to speak, when you protested at Pretoria High School against the discrimination of black hair. Would you say that literally propelled you into full-on activism? While you tell us about yourself.
Surprisingly, I wouldn't say it propelled me into activism. I grew up socially aware of the conditions which I knew were made for me by the systems that govern our society, right, and the various institutions that govern our societies. So I grew up very socially aware, and I grew up socially aware because of my unique experiencing South Africa's democracy, right? My experience being a girl from a working class, interfaith and interracial background, and not just the interracial background, which everyone thinks is so nice and interesting. Oh, she's half white, half black. No, my father's Indian and he's an immigrant. So already there was some stigma attached to the fact that I have an immigrant father, right? So I grew up socially aware because my experience wasn't lovey-dovey freedom, right? I could pick up what racism was from the age of 4. I knew it wasn't just, oh, I'm being bullied. I knew that is blatant racism, right? So I grew up quite socially aware, and going into schools that are not prepared for racial integration, where these are merely just schools where the gates were just open for everyone, but the actual system and the actual cultures and traditions that build up this institution weren't interrogated. It's just the gates that were opened, right? Were not interrogated, and you just go into this environment whereby you've got people who run the institution, have been running the institution, the same people, like they say, I've been here for 60 years, and it's the same people who ran this institution when it was very only exclusive to white girls only, and so they're not themselves prepared to be teaching a black girl or a mixed race girl. They're not prepared for that, right? So they can be very blatantly racist as well. So going into that institution and being someone who isn't accepting of mistreatment.
Zuleika Patel, just introducing herself and what she really does. For now, let's take a break. Zuleika, continue where you left off. You were saying you wrote a book. Tell us about that.
Yeah, since then I published my first book last year, My Coily Crowny Hair, which is a book that actually it's written through the lens of a 7-year-old girl named Lisa Kanya, deliberately named Lisa Kanya because of the meaning of the name, and also primarily because I wanted representation for difficult names, you know. So basically Lisa Kanya is on a journey. She already loves herself, but on this journey she's going to fall in love with her hair more, because she's going to learn about how versatile black hair is, and how black hair is more than just hair. Historically, black hair is expression, identity, it's power, status, who you are in society, and she learns that with her grandmother, right? And basically when I wrote this book, it was because I wanted to communicate with children, because I felt that children are often very looked over, yet that's the most important demographic in society.
Moving on to the issues of transgender activism, the story of when you visited a doctor and when you were supposed to be examined, then what happened?
So I went to a hospital, and then I was really, really sick. And so a doctor then asked me when last did I go to my periods. So I said to her, I don't go to my periods. Said, why? I said, because I'm trans. Said, oh no, you're a man.
No, you are not a man.
Oh, no. And then she left me there. Hours later, I think then when her shift has ended, someone else had come in, and then she asked me, what was I doing there? I said, well, the doctor that was here left because she said I was a man. And, you know, my question then became, I'm like, okay, let's remove gender aside. I think when she applied for that job, she was not there to help female or male patients. She's just there to help patients. So this was really blatant discrimination and hate.
And I'd like to pick up on that and maybe just talk about accessing services in general, because this is a continuous thing that you are experiencing, Yaya, and not just from a medical professional, right, who has an ethical duty to help and assist anyone that comes to the front. I think it speaks deeper to just educating every single member of society, because you would think that someone who's gone to school and has a degree in medicine understands, or at least has the language, right, to be like, okay, transgender, that means even though that they do not have a period, they identify as a woman, and that is enough for me right now, right?
Absolutely.
But if we think about people in rural areas who don't have the access to the information that we do, to the resources that we do, how then do we expect society to move progressively forward if we're not teaching them these terms, the differences? I spoke to Yolisa outside of the roundtable, and we were just chatting about how I'm not even sure if people understand what the different meanings of the term LGBTQIA+. What does the plus stand for? When we speak about orientation and identity being on a spectrum, do people understand that that actually includes heterosexual, cis-het men and women as well, right? The idea is inclusion, not exclusion. But if you never see yourself as on that spectrum, then it's always going to be something that's other. And I think that really it's such a disservice to children, first of all, right? Because I think maybe what needs to happen is that we're writing books about our experiences as well, to locate that into history, right? For this big demographic who are going to go on and essentially run the country at some point. Give them the terminology, give them the education, but it also can't be exclusive to where there is access.
Tell you what.
I think also when you're talking about inclusion, South Africa has a progressive kind of constitution when it comes to LGBTI persons. I mean, although it does not specifically state that it's LGBTI, you know, it just talks about sexual orientation, you know, freedom of expression, yes. But when we talk about this was secondary victimization, you know. I mean, you got into a space where you are going to say you're going to be helping people. So why is it that your personal comes into your profession? Which is what we deal with on a daily basis, you know. We do SOGI training, sexual orientation, gender identity trainings with different departments, and we've done a lot of trainings with healthcare workers, and you think by now people know, you know, about LGBTI and not to victimize. It's the same with police stations. You go into a police station and you report a hate crime or intimate partner violence between two women or two men. It then becomes a wawungam shayang, like, why didn't you fight for yourself? You know, that secondary victimization is it's important to note, you know, in these professions.
I don't even think it's an education issue, because people actually know. They choose just to be hateful. They choose to say, I'm going to belittle this person, because there is no way that a person that is a professional would decide.
Well, perhaps it's a combination, because as a queer woman from rural areas and having grown in a township, the only time I got to get information was when I watched TV and saw activists like Bev Ditsi. And that's when I could identify that, oh, actually, I'm not so-called abnormal, right? But you worked at Equal Education. Perhaps, generally, you can pick this up after Sitla. How bad is this issue? Yaya feels like it's perhaps ignorance. People tend to be insulting as well. They'll call us the alphabet gang because they're not interested in knowing many things about the community.
It's such a cheap shot. It's funny for the moment and catchy, but really, if we draw parallels with racism, and Zuleika will know this, when you make fun of people who are marginalized, it can only last so long. And so if there's an intolerance for judging and discriminating against someone based on their skin color, why would it be ever okay to make fun of their identity or orientation, right? But moving along to the question about civil society and education, it's just at an infrastructure level and the way that people engage with education, we know that it's stratified against class and race lines, right? So where you are determines what kind of education you're going to access. But then there's a secondary question to that, is that, well, if there are LGBT people in society in general, then that means they're in schools as well. How about those children being looked after? There was a point at which I ran a workshop at Equal Education with some of the youth members there around a bill in the Western Cape that was speaking about sexual orientation and gender identities. And it was really littered with some troubling language. And that is why we bring the children into the room, because I'm no longer in school. Even if I can pick up something that is wrong with a legislative bill, right, at a policy level, because I was a parliamentary officer, and so that was my role of being in that room. But I'm not going to, this bill isn't going to affect my life directly. So that's why you need the children in the room to kind of state, well, what's happening in schools at the moment. And what you're finding is that the discrimination that we're facing as adults, in fact, starts at a young age. And so in a way, we're almost socializing people to feel like they must sensitize themselves before they come out.
For sure.
And that often leads to issues of depression, suicide,
Right.
etc., right? Let's take a break. So much to say, so little time. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us once again. We continue with the conversation, and we start with Gina Lee. Gina Lee, you know, Stats SA asserts that almost 18 million young people between the ages of 18 and 24 in this country. Yet, as you say, they don't have a seat at the table. I mean, just by merely looking at our political leaders in this country, we are led by women who are between the ages of 60 and 75 and so on.
So the median age in Parliament is actually 59, and only 9% of people in Parliament are under the age of 30. So we have a major crisis in terms of leaders leading representationally. We need young people in these spaces to actually enact the change that we need to see. Schools are very problematic, very backwards, and very retrogressive in terms of the education that they're supplying and the conversations that they're having. We are not having conversations with regards to LGBTQ issues, with regards to critical race theory, with regards to class issues within school systems. And the places that are the most progressive are predominantly white, type C, public schools in the Western Cape, which isn't really the space that we need to be penetrating in terms of having these important conversations. Change rarely happens with children. There's so many issues with regards to children because we aren't even having conversations with regards to consent and children. Children aren't taught consent at school, and that's why we see children are very much impacted by gender-based violence, by sexual violence, by violence in general, and by hate crimes because of this. Children don't feel comfortable to talk about these issues that are impacting them socially, mentally, physically, economically, and we also don't give them access to the vocabulary that they need to even express themselves. We need to be telling children real words to talk about their private parts. We need to be telling children real words to talk about gender, to talk about sexual identity, to talk about physical traits. We aren't giving children access to this vocabulary, and because of that, children aren't having these conversations, and children are growing up to be adults that are bigoted, that discriminate against you because you're transgender. It all starts at the level of children.
I wanted to add there is that I was speaking to Zuleika earlier and being like, you know, we have been watching you since you were 13. I can't believe you're 19 now, what? And I said to you, I was so inspired because I remember being young and I wish I could have been the kind of activist you were at that age. And you said, but I didn't think that I was an activist. I didn't have that language. And if you can attest the same, I shared the similar experience kind of growing up in the Eastern Cape. My small acts of defiance, I could never locate within something bigger, right? And I wonder from your perspective, what is that about the languaging of advocacy, of activism and feminism that isn't accessible to us, even though we're aware, right? Because we grew up socially aware, which is why we're able to point out when we see something as racism or as sexism or as discrimination. But certainly there's a lag between when you know something is wrong and when you can call it out as a specific kind of discrimination.
I think that's very much, and I'm also gonna, when I answer, I'm gonna pick up on what you said. That is very much tied to what South Africa is currently going through, right? South Africa is currently going through, basically, we're a country which is suffering terrible inequality, but we've got extremely good PR on the fact that we're a democratic, free society and we're the rainbow nation and we've been fought for and emancipated, right?
Yes.
But we are going through extreme, horrible inequality that is increasing each day. And the lack of having the right language is birthed in the fact that we want to continue this notion and continue to socialize children with the fact that they are born free. Everyone born after 1994 has been socialized. All of us at this table, I'm not sure about the host, all of us at this table,
That's your business.
all of us at this table have gone through this socialization that we are born free, we are free, and we are living in this free country. And growing up, we never would have assumed we'd be sitting at these tables discussing issues that delve into our personal freedom of our identity. And I believe there's no other reason as to why people do not have the correct language. It's primarily because you are avoiding the correct language, because when you have the correct language, you can highlight all the existing issues and see how unequal our society is and how far we still are from this notion and ideology of freedom, and how much it's just merely just a dream and a fragment of our imaginations, and it's not actually a reality. That's the reason why we don't have that language. And there's a phobia in giving children that language, because then you're afraid that you're going to produce another generation of people like Fees Must Fall activists, or another generation of activists like Pretoria High School for Girls, right? You're afraid of that. So you're afraid of giving children that language. And that is so problematic when you don't give children that language. Like she mentioned, children don't even have the correct language to address their bodily autonomy, right? They can't talk about that without any shame attached to that. Children can't talk about consent, but then you have an issue where it conflicts with the fact that children are apparently allowed to give consent. A 12-year-old can give consent, but doesn't know what that is, in a sense whereby it's not just saying yes, it's more than yes. Exploring how it can be taken back, and how you don't have to give consent to someone because you know them. Exploring those different scenarios with children, that's not allowed. And then that, you see, is the reason why our inequality continues to grow, is because children don't have that language. And when they don't have that language, they can't identify and talk about the issues, right? And when they can't talk about the issues can never be addressed. So they continue to grow and build up these issues, right?
Suleika says we're such a PR-focused country, so to speak. And that reminds me that actually we're the first country to legalize same-sex marriage, right? If not the only country on the African continent. But are those the lived experiences of LGBTQI people?
You can do that again.
It's so unfortunate that, even those that pass those laws, they don't even maybe understand what are they passing.
Say that again, hey?
It's just a matter of like ticking boxes, ticking boxes.
Part of the PR.
You go to your home affairs as a married couple. Tell you what, a person that works at its home affairs, it works at home affairs, the same space where they're supposed to have known everything that you are coming there for. They don't know, it becomes a huge struggle. Beside even like those that are married, I remember I went to recently, so when I lost my passport, after having received a new ID number that identifies me as female, they have not removed my old
Your dead name.
Updated.
So now, when I have to now reapply for a new one, I can't, because then both of them are active.
And they have different names also.
And
using different pronouns, obviously.
Yeah. Yes.
absolutely. Then, which means now it brings to me now having to explain myself to the person that is assisting me here because the system hasn't done what it's supposed to do. Can you then imagine a married couple who is female, going to Home Affairs and they are going to be questioned by, oh my gosh, but you're both female. How, it's so painful. That's like I said, I don't even think it's an education thing. It's people just like not wanting to, to be involved. It's people just saying, I actually don't care. This is what I think of you, and this is what I'm going to treat you like.
The rhetoric that exists is supposed to be creating this inclusive space. But if we talk about ID numbers, it shows your gender, like your assigned sex at birth, your race. It shows so many different factors about you that could lead to discrimination, and it's so entirely problematic. Why do we need to have our sex in our ID number? And why do you have to apply to change that ID number? And even if you do change your name and you don't change your ID number, if someone clocks on that, it's a different sex
and
to what you...
your life in danger. Puts Yaya's life in danger. Because at this point now, Yaya is moving around, navigating life with a dead name and a dead kind of gender marker in life. So how is Yaya going to now get a different passport? She will then have to refight. Imagine fighting and then fighting again.
My life then is on standstill.
It is.
Until
it's
it
on a
has
hold.
to be fixed.
And my question around that is, when you guys, Jade, are then tracking forms of hate crime, where's the space to report a case like this? Because this is technically, again, a form of discrimination. The law says one thing, but the way that you live and enact with that right within a democratic space, right? We know that the country and the world sees us as this amazingly inclusive, tolerant country, but you're saying something different.
I don't think I can meet any queer person who can say,
living a fruitful life.
do you understand? My life is amazing. The government has really made my life easy. No.
Let's actually pick up on that, especially the hate crimes issue, after this break. Welcome back to our discussion. We're talking about LGBTQI issues and youth-related issues. So little time, so much to say. We continue with this conversation. Jade, earlier on, before we went on a break, Sihle had actually asked about hate crime-related issues, particularly with what Yaya had been saying, and also Ujinali referring to kids, children, who are directly affected with hate crimes. I mean, you work in the criminal justice system monitoring hate crimes. How bad is it?
It's really bad. Like, it's top tier bad in South Africa. Like 2021 and 2022, we saw a lot of hate crimes cases, right? And there are hate crimes cases that are not documented. For example, if Usihle from Ekunu has been molested or is discriminated against because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, because in those parts of the country you can't really be gay and lesbian because of the traditions, right? It really dates back to traditions. It also talks to patriarchy and misogyny. You know, if you are a Zulu boy, for example, and you are gay, that's not allowed. You must go and slaughter a goat and all of these things. You know? So people do not even kind of report these cases because they don't know how to go about them. You know, and we are the ones that have to access kind of these people. But so the cases that we have had to deal with have predominantly been of black lesbian women, you know, and the kind of how their deaths come about. You can see that it is a hate crime, you know. It's not just, and I'm sorry to say this, it's not just like killing just like a woman, for example, or femicide. It's not just femicide. There are things that come with it, you know. I'm thinking about the cases that I have worked on. One particular case of I think it's UD. Yeah, where Timberlake Sekela. A mop was inserted in her vagina. So that alone, you can see, and the horrific murders are a clear example that you are not a lesbian, you are not a man. That's how people kind of think of black butch so identifying lesbians. They want to show you that you are a woman, you are not a man, you know. And then you'd see, for example, Timberlake's boxer shorts kind of hanging over, and then this thing is being inserted. And the way in which it's so degrading, in the way in which they murder these people, because they're trying to show whoever is going to see that body that I was trying to fix you.
There's definitely a power dynamic.
There is a power dynamic,
We also don't talk about it. I don't know how we address that. Even when you are marginalized, you can still have power within certain spaces.
Yes, definitely.
So another black person enacting violence on another black body, but because they are heterosexual and are a man who have patriarchy, in that instance, they certainly hold power. And it's absolutely, it just almost made me emotional now, because I'm just like, how the hell are we expected to live in a world like this? And this is why we have to draw the nuances of how this queer body works life and how another one does. Because until Thembelihle is okay to walk in the street, which she wasn't afforded that space now, she's no more here. But if she was okay to walk the street and feel safe, then perhaps the work is done. But to constantly have, I even think about you, Jade, who has to every single day listen to these horrific, very detailed instances of how people are being treated. That in itself is not okay. And I think that as a community and as a society, we're traumatized. There's so much going on at a psychological level that we're not addressing. And it has been passed on from the legacy of apartheid in one part, but also just colonization and racism and genocide that has been enacted. Ethicide, any kind of trying to point out an other has always led to the destruction of a race and of a society, and it absolutely breaks my heart. I can't.
And I mean, when we talk about hate crimes, right? And the hate crimes bill was out a couple of years ago, I think in 2017, and it's still somewhere in Parliament, just lingering there. And this is important for us to have this hate crime and hate speech bill. For these reasons, you know, our policies are great on paper. A lot of countries call us the land of milk and honey. And then we in the honey and the milk, we are suffering because our policies are great, but on the ground, like...
It's not the lived experience.
This is our lived experience. Discrimination, Yaya has to navigate life as a person that has a dead name, you know, and has to still navigate that life right now. You know, there are black lesbians that have to be careful of how they dress now because it's rough. It's really rough. I can't hold my partner's hand. I remember last year, she was taking me to an Uber and I couldn't kiss her because I am scared, right? This is now coming to me. It hits home because it's also coming to me where I can't even hold her hand in public.
Because you're going to enter into this car and you don't know
I don't know if I'm going to come back or not. When we're walking in the mall, I can't hold her hand because I'm just like, dude, no.
Exactly, and this is why when you say people refer to us as the land of milk and honey, we have a fantastic constitution, right? As a law student, I myself, the constitution, it's an impeccable constitution that speaks on redress even. There's not a lot of constitutions in the world that even touch on the subject of redress. However, this is where it comes back to inclusion in the implementation of policies is key and critical because you cannot implement policies for people without them. This is why everything we've tried to do for youth unemployment has failed us because we don't do it with the unemployed youth. We sit with the 9% of employed youth in Parliament and then you ask yourself, okay, how much must we give them in SASSA grants? How much must we give them? How much must we do this for them? Instead of sitting with the unemployed youth itself and drafting these policies and also building these systems that are meant to alleviate alleviate the pressure that is put onto their shoulders. You don't sit with them. Then you want to draft bills for queer people, but you're not sitting with them and you're not involving them in the implementation, right? So that's why it's so important, and that's why I believe that we haven't gone forward in terms of the implementation of equity into our society, is because we don't sit with the marginalized. We sit with a small privileged crop of people we sit with maybe the privileged crop of young black people who are afforded the opportunity to attend former Model C schools and are now employed because of the opportunity accessed in attending such schools. They've gone on to study at your Stellenbosch Wits University, and now you sit with that small crop only and you ask them to help you draft policies for the greater youth who hasn't had that access, right? And you don't involve them, and then after that you say, this is what we've done for you, right? Or it just lingers in the atmosphere, right? So I think that going forward, there has to be a very, very radical approach to inclusion in this country, because you can't have a parliament that is run by unfortunately, people who should be retiring, majority of them, have an entire country where the presidency is run by someone who is at the retirement age, and then you have a 9% of young people that are in parliament, but then in that 9%, are you asking yourself, in that 9%, is there a queer person representing queer youth? Is there a young person to speak for young people from rural areas?
And as we round up this conversation, Zuleika, if you were to also, like Zuleika has just rounded this issue up, what needs to be done? What can you conscientize the society with and say? And I know, ladies, there's so much to say, and so I'm going to ask you to make it really brief.
So I think besides representational change, we actually need physical, systematic redress. If you just think of the most practical things, the way that bathrooms in public spaces are created creates systemic divides. There's no space for gender non-conforming people or for trans people that don't feel comfortable in particular bathrooms. There's so many issues within just our systemic, real-life, structural problems. I mean, for deaf people, it's very difficult to access spaces. There's so much ableism going on. So we really have to kind of recreate society and think about how we can create actual pragmatic change, not just talking about it, actually doing it.
Sita?
I think the language of radicalism scares people to some extent, and so if you're afraid of that term, if you struggle with identifying as a feminist or an activist, but you know and you can see that something is going on, my only ask is that you call it out. That is the way that we move forward. So no, we may be a rainbow nation, but we don't all experience and have access to rights the same way. Yes, I might be queer and you're heterosexual, but you can see how someone is looking at me or treating me differently in a certain space, and it's not a question for the 6 people here at this table to be the ones that are constantly doing the work. I need every single person in South Africa to ask themselves, how am I contributing to the society that I want to live in, that future generations can live in? And if your answer is that I'm not doing enough, then I'm asking you to start doing anything. But to keep quiet and to assume that the same things that you are watching happen are going to get fixed or addressed, we know that has not been working.
Jade, you've emphasized a lot about the hate crimes bill. Is that what you would like to just emphasize a bit more?
Yeah, I think the hate crimes bill, hate crime and hate speech bill should be in effect, because it's really rough out here. 2021, 2022, we've seen a lot of queer deaths, and I think also in terms of sexual orientation, gender identity education, there needs to be more of that on the grassroots level. Organizations like Forum for the Empowerment of Women that do this work need to be funded by the government, because we're not funded by the government, unfortunately. To do all of these trainings at Home Affairs, at SAPS, and in clinics, we need for this work to be funded.
Furthermore, there needs to be actual education inside schools. It doesn't always have to rely on civil society with civil society money. We need proper bills in schools, and right now, unfortunately, the only party really pushing this office is the DA, which has a lot of problems within itself, and that education, we know we won't be inclusive. So we actually need to have a really big conversation about what education we're actually giving to children.
And let's wrap it up with the Yaya.
I think the government needs to get back to work. It's about time. They get back to the office and actually do the work. When they get there, can they do it with passion and understand that, what, people at home, they're relying on them. But also people at home need to decide, right, need to know very well, why am I deciding on this and how is this decision going to affect my life, going forward. And I think as human beings, we just need to do better.
Yeah.
When we do better, so much change would happen in our lives.
Well, thank you so much, ladies. That's all the time we have for this lively and critical conversation. Goodbye from us, and thank you so much for joining us.